What's up, guys? This episode's been a really long time coming, but I'm glad to be able to finally bring it to you, and that is deploying Rails on Ubuntu server. So this is going to cover just the general idea of everything that you have to do, and specifically we're going to use the latest version of Ubuntu 14.04 LTS. So Ubuntu has these long-term support versions, the LTS versions, and those versions are designed to get security updates for like 2 or 4 years, the long-term basically. So every 6 months they come out with a new version, but they continue supporting this one while they kill off all the other ones in between. So this is hugely important when you're running a server because you don't want security issues in production, and losing data in people's credit cards and email addresses is a terrible thing. So if you do this, make sure that you use the long-term support versions of Ubuntu, and they come out usually every 2 years. So to get started, basically go to gorails.com, deploy Ruby on Rails guide, and use the latest version that's available there for you. Make sure that it's Ubuntu 14.04 or another LTS version. They come out every 2 years, so if you're watching this in 2016, there will be one that comes out April of 2016. So follow that guide. It will be most up to date with everything, but this video will be able to help you like walk through it and think through it. Make sure you understand everything that I'm trying to explain as we go along. So the other piece that you're going to need is a server to really get started. I really recommend DigitalOcean. There's other great ones like Linode, AWS, Rackspace, you name it. My preference lately has been DigitalOcean. They're super fast, run on SSDs. And I've just had really, really great support, and they've been growing like crazy, and I like that. So check out the link in the post to DigitalOcean if you want to use my referral code and get, I think it's like $10 off right now for your Droplet. So to get started with this, you're going to go create a Droplet on DigitalOcean or create a server pretty much anywhere that you would like. And you'll have to give it a name. And I'm going to just call one GoRails. This will be the server's host name. And then you get to choose the size of your server. Now, Rails really being built on Ruby and having SQL or Postgres databases along with it to run it, you're probably going to want to at least have a gig of RAM. So RAM is really the crucial piece here. Because all of your storage and transfer limits are not going to be as relevant when you're getting started for the very first time. So you could go with the $5 a month server, and that could be fine. But you're going to start like running into memory issues where your site will either be slow or things just end up taking up storage space on the server when it runs out of memory. And that's not going to be great for you. So I'd recommend at least the $10 a month plan. But you could get by with 5 if you need to. I've done that before, and it works all right. So choose the region closest to you. I'm going to choose New York 3 because I live here in New York right now. And you're going to select the Ubuntu 16.04 x64 version. So x64 means that it's 64-bit. You basically don't have to worry about anything not running on 64-bit these days. And you're also going to want to make sure you choose the latest long-term support one, like I said. So don't use 15.04 or 15.10. Wait until 16.04 comes out. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're not going to look at the applications. I know that you can do the basic like auto setup Ruby on Rails 14.04 server if you would like. And this is basically going to set up similar setup as what we would do, but I'm designing this so that you can go do it from scratch by hand so you can understand everything that's happening. That would set it up all for you and you wouldn't have a clue what's going on, and that kind of sucks when you're running your own server and you're in charge of security for it. So you should know what you're using before you go and do that. So that's why we're going to do this from scratch. You can set up any of these available settings if you would like. Backups, you could do IPv6. And you can also do like private networking if you ever want to like have droplets or servers talk to each other. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to skip this SSH key section right now. You could do that if you would like. This is basically what we're going to do, but we're going to do that from the command line. So once you click Create Droplet, it will take about 60 seconds to set it up, which is super duper fast. And you will get an email with the password for the root account on the server. So I'm going to pull that up here on my other screen, and we will have that available in just a second. Alrighty, so this is our brand new server. We have this IP address here, and we basically just need to SSH into it to get started. Now, I've copied the password for this server, for the root server from my email so that we have that. And we're basically just going to open up our terminal, and we're going to SSH in, and we're going to do that by saying SSH root at this IP address that we have here. So I've already got the password on the clipboard, so I'm going to type this in, 104.236.40.175. So you'll get this message which basically says, hey, you've never connected to this server before. This is its RSA key fingerprint. Do you want to continue, yes or no? Basically, this just says you can approve this, and then in the future, if that ever changes, for some reason, maybe someone hijacked your server, if you get this message again, be careful because you may have been hacked or something like that. And as soon as you log in, you're going to need to type in your password one more time, and it's going to prompt you to put in a new password. So we'll put in a new one here. And this is your root user password. So the root user is the one that really owns everything about the server. They're the admin for your Linux machine. So if we type exit, we should be able to now copy our SSH key over to the root like that, and we're going to use this thing called Ssh Copy Id. Now, if you type this command and it says command not found, you can make sure that you install it. And I'm on a Mac, so I can just say brew install Ssh Copy Id. Make sure you install Homebrew if you haven't done that before, but Linux will already come with this, and you'll probably want to do this from Linux if you're deploying. So basically what Ssh Copy Id does is take your local SSH key's public key and then puts it on the server. So what you would have is you should already have an SSH key if you're using Git, and it's basically this SSH ID RSA.pub file, and it's taking this information. This is your public SSH key, and it's taking that and putting it on the server inside an authorized keys file. So it's basically saying, let's put the copy of this on the server and make sure that this user is allowed to log in without having to type in a password next time. They can just log in with the SSH keys that are available by default. That's much more secure than a password and is what you will always want to use when you're doing anything like this in the future. So Ssh Copy Id allows us to do that automatically without having to edit the files and take care of that on your own. But if you don't have access to Ssh Copy Id, feel free to go ahead and look up how to do that manually. And what you're going to do is the exact same thing as you would with the SSH command. You can actually scroll back up and change the command to Ssh Copy Id. And this will ask for your root password again. And this is your new password. And it will set the key on the machine so that next time you run SSH root at, you should just get logged in automatically. This will now ask you for your SSH keys password, not your new root server password. So I know there's a lot of passwords going on here, but this is now your SSH keys password that you should already know. And you use this for Git and anything like GitHub, for example. So now we have this set up so that if we are able to log in that one time, now we can log into the server without having to put in a password, except for that first time, which is really, really nifty. So now we can connect to our server, and we're already up to date because it's a brand new instance of Ubuntu 14.04. So the next piece that we have to do is add a user that we're going to use for running our applications. Now I'm going to add a user called deploy, and this user is going to be the one that our applications run as, and we'll give him a password as well. And you can hit enter to not fill out any of those, and then yes to continue. So we now have this deploy user, and we need to allow them to do root level things with sudo. So you can add user deploy sudo, which will put them in the sudoers group, and that allows them to run commands as root with sudo. So if you go su deploy, this is going to log you in as the deploy user, and you can go to like your home directory and do all of that. But you should be able to run sudo ls now. If you type in the deploy user's password, that should run without failing, like it just did. So the next piece that we want to make sure to do is to also do a ssh copy id on the deploy user. So the deploy user is the one that we're actually going to be doing most of our work from on the server, and that's the one that's crucial to kind of do your SSH copy ID on, because this is just going to save you so much time logging in and typing passwords. It just is going to be much more convenient. So you put in the deploy user's password, and the next time that you SSH in, you can SSH in as deploy. And this does not ask for a password either, because it's using your Git SSH key password. So that is great, and basically the next step for us to do is to grab the list of packages to install for Ruby. So I'm going to install the latest Ruby, and I'm going to grab all of these dependencies for that. So we're compiling Ruby from source, and we need all of these packages to be installed on our machine in order to do that appropriately. So we don't need to, we can run apt-get update first, and that will allow us to make sure that we always have the list of the latest versions of these packages. And then here we'll copy this line after this is finished and install those packages. So this will take a little bit of time to install everything, but hit yes to accept it, and that will get ahead at installing. Okay, so that has all completed. We've got all of those packages installed, and we're going to use rbenv to install our Ruby version. Now, you could use RVM if you're more familiar with it, or you could do it from source, but I recommend using RBenv because it just plays a lot nicer with production web servers because it's a little bit simpler. So I usually just copy and paste these lines and hit enter, and do the same thing with each of these chunks. So what we're doing is first we're installing rbenv, and we're setting up our bash prompt, this shell prompt, to load rbenv when it gets started. The next piece here is loading Ruby build into your system so that it can compile the latest version of Ruby. And then the last one here is the rbenv gem rehash. And basically, when you install a gem, when you're in rbenv, it will automatically run the rehash command to make all the executables available. So last but not least here, you run rbenv install the version number, and then you set the global version number, and then you run ruby-v to make sure that you have that correctly. Now, you can also check rubylang.org to see what the latest version of Ruby is. I haven't updated the site yet, but 2.2.2 is the latest version. So we're going to do that. We're going to rbenv install 2.2.2. And this will run, download, compile everything on the server, and we will see you in a second. All right, we're back. That should have taken quite a while because it was compiling everything from source, and Ruby's pretty big and it's got a lot to do. So now we can set the global version of Ruby on the server to 2.2.2, And then if we run ruby-v, we should get 2.2.2. And we do. So we've got Ruby installed, and that's awesome. Now we can jump to the next section of our application. You can optionally add this line if you would like. This will basically not install documentation for gems when you install them. I like to do this. It saves a little time setting up gems. And then we want to make sure that we have bundler installed so that when we send our Rails application over, it can invoke bundler, which will install Rails and all our dependencies. But bundler is required to exist on the server before you can deploy your Rails app. Otherwise, you'll get an error when you install Capistrano and try and run it on the server. So next up is to add Nginx to your application. So you'll need to first install the Nginx. Basically, you need to install Nginx, a special version of it from Fusion Passenger. Fusion is the company that makes a wonderful Rails compatible server called Fusion Passenger. And if you want to learn some more about how that works, you can take a look at their guides. They do an awesome job. And if you ever need to check out how this should get installed, take a look at their documentation. It should be the latest. I try and keep mine up to date, but definitely read through what they do as well. So you're going to want to first add those keys onto your server so that it can verify them. And then you're going to want to install, and they also recommend installing the CA certificates here, as you might have noticed. So you can install those two packages. For example, we've already got both of them on our server, and that's totally cool. And then we need to add a repository so that Ubuntu can know where to look to install Passenger. So we'll run those 4 commands, and the last piece will allow us to install Nginx and Passenger together on our server. So that is really all we have to do to start our server, and we can run. Once these are done, we can start Nginx on our server and test it out and make sure that we get the correct output on our IP address. So let's wait just a second for this to finish, and we'll see what happens. Okay, that's complete, and now we can run sudo service nginx start. And that will basically run the Nginx service that we just installed with the Nginx package. And that means that if you take your IP address from DigitalOcean and you put that into your browser, you should now get a welcome to Nginx on Ubuntu. And that means Nginx is running. And if you want to test it and see how this works, if you say service nginx stop, and you try and refresh this again, it's dead. But if you do start, it's back up. So we now can control our web server on our server using this command. So take note of that. If you ever need to restart it for some reason, this is what you're going to run. You'll run sudo service nginx restart. So that is all you need to know for that. And now we got basically the passenger configuration for this. So one of the things that you need to do is run sudo vim etc nginx conf.d, and then you need the nginx.conf file. And inside here, you're basically going to change a couple things. So I like to change the user to deploy so that we are running all of our web stuff under the deploy user. And then if you search for passenger here, you can comment out this line here or paste in the appropriate one that you need for RBenv or RVM or regular Ruby. And this is basically telling Nginx which version of Ruby it should be using globally to run your software. I also have this passenger route line that I put in there, and that may or may not do anything. I'm not entirely sure what it is, so feel free to look that up if you need to, but I haven't had any trouble with that before. So this last piece is basically, now that we've got that set up, we need to do a sudo service nginx restart to reload the configuration and use that version of Ruby. And now you'll see that if we do the restart, you should get this message, and if you don't get it, chances are that something went wrong. If something has gone wrong, you can look at, you can run tail /var/logs nginx, and then there's an error file in here. And you have to do that as root. I think it's error.log. Yeah. So you have to run that sudo command so that you can get the output of that file and see. It will tell you in here if anything is wrong in your Nginx configuration. So if you made any typos or something, it will let you know here, but it doesn't let you know in the command line, which is a little annoying. So now we have that all set up, and you're welcome to choose whichever database you would like. My personal preference is to use Postgres for almost everything. It's an order of magnitude more awesome than MySQL, in my opinion, and allows you to do all kinds of awesome stuff and is actively being used in some of the biggest places that you can imagine, like Heroku uses this, and you're probably already somewhat familiar with it. So you can take and copy either one of these commands to set up and install the database of your choice, and make sure that you get the dev packages, because these are going to be required when you take your Rails application and compile the MySQL 2 gem or the Postgres gem, the PG gem. Those dev packages are required because they give you the header files that allow the Ruby C extensions to connect to the database quickly, and they're required to compile those gems. So with Postgres, you have 2 or 3 extra things to do. First, you need to log in as the Postgres operating system user, and this is going to allow us to create a Postgres user. So here we could just say, let's make a, I'm just going to put the password as password for this. And take note of this. You're also going to need, I believe, to pass in a username. So we'll say password is password, and we'll use this in our, so there we go. So you'll need to put in your username there, and then 2 passwords, or the same password twice. And this will be the username and password that you put into your database.yamo file later on. So I'm using the same username there, but be aware that there's an operating Ubuntu system user, and then there's also a Postgres user named deploy. So here, now that we have that set up, we need to begin by adding Capistrano into our application. So you're going to need basically your Rails app. You're going to need to add these to your gem file. You're going to need to make sure you add Capistrano RVM and or Capistrano RVM, depending on what you're using. So let's dive into our Rails app. Okay, so I actually do not have a Rails application ready yet, but let's run this on a brand new Rails app so that you can see the commit that I make with all of the code in between. So we'll have a brand new Rails app. We'll have a commit for all the Capistrano stuff, so you can reference this if you'd like. So I'm just going to make one called deploy test, and you'll be able to find that on my GitHub profile. So hopping back into our Capistrano setup, you can use any of these versions. I'm going to make sure that we're using the latest versions of these. So we're going to look for Capistrano. I believe Capistrano Rails might also include Capistrano Bundler, but we'll check it out. So if we find Capistrano here, 3.4.0 is the latest version. We are going to put that in our gem file in this new deploy test Rails app. So first, let me get init dot, and we'll add all these files in. This will be our first commit. And then let's also get up on GitHub and make a repository for this so that you can check it out soon. So make a repository called deploy test, see how to deploy Rails to Ubuntu with Capistrano. So make this repository, and then I will push that code up there. And then before we do anything at all, then we can now add, now we can go to Capistrano. We can grab the latest version for our gem file, and we can do the same thing with Capistrano Rails. So let's look that up, and let's see. Yes, it depends on Capistrano bundler, so we don't explicitly have to add that to our gem file like the instructions say. So that's kind of nice. And then we also need Capistrano RB-env, and most likely you can use this from the the Ruby gems version. So if we look that up, you should be able to use this 2.0.3. But sometimes if you have issues with this, use the GitHub version that I specified from basically their master branch, which will get always the latest version. So we have that, and it's also easy to just put this in the development group because these are only going to be really used in the development environment. You're not going to need them in staging or production or test. You'll only have Capistrano around when you are in development mode and you're deploying your code to production or staging. So you can do that, and that's simply all you need to do, and run bundler inside your Rails app, and that will install all of those. And then there's a couple things that you can do. So you can run bundle -- bin stubs to make sure that we get the Capistrano bin stubs in the bin folder. And we'll do that as soon as the gems are installed. So now we can run bundle bin stubs and cap install stages production. So this is going to determine a multi-stage Rails environment or deploy. So if you were to say stages production, staging, this would allow you to have two different things, and you could say cap production deploy and cap staging deploy, and deploy this to two servers instead of just one. And that would allow you to have a test environment and a production environment. And that would allow you to test your code out with real data before you actually deploy it to production. But I'm going to leave that out, and we're just going to set up a production stage. And you can see here that this creates the config deploy production file. The config deploy.rb file is the global settings for everything. And then the deploy production is going to say, here's the production server settings. And then if you were to do a staging one, that would have a different IP address, for example. So that is all that it takes to get Capistrano installed. But we have to edit a few things. So our cap file here is basically what this is basically this thing that sets up all these automatic things to run with bundler. And one of those automatic things we need to do is set the RB-env section in here. So you can put this anywhere you like after the deploy section. And basically you want this to be user because that's how we set our RVM setup. And then you can do 2.2, and you can optionally include the patch version. I believe that if we run ruby-v, we'll see that it's patch version 95. So I'm going to put that in here. And that is how we configure Capistrano to use RB-env. But you'll need to do that after this require RBM section. So that will require the gem for us and then allow us to set these two options. And the last piece that we need to do is make sure that the Rails section gets set up here. So my example here, we require Capistrano bundler and Capistrano Rails. The Capistrano Rails one might also automatically do bundler for you. Not completely sure, but you can look that up and see what it does. And then I'm not sure, but let's try using Capistrano Passenger, because that might help us restart Passenger automatically. So now that we've got that set up, we can take a look at the config deploy file. And this is basically saying let's always make sure we use this version of Capistrano. If you're to upgrade your Capistrano gem, you'll also want to upgrade this lock version. You have to give your application a name, and we're just going to name ours deploy test, and then you update this to match your GitHub or Bitbucket or basically your Git URL. So here I'm going to use deploy test, and this is where we'll be able to get our repository. And then you have a bunch of options. Almost all of these options are great, but I would like to suggest changing this one to home/deploy/deploy test, or whatever your application name is for this piece. This will put it in your home directory on the server for the deploy user. So when you log in, you'll have access to that folder for the Rails application right there. As soon as you log in, it's right there and available. That's pretty nice. And I like to do that because it just saves so much time. Now, take a look at some of these other options. You can set it up so that it will remove the release folders during cleanup and all of that stuff. You can have things like that clearing the cache out on deploy. Basically, it has its own little DSL so that you can write your own custom commands to be run as deployment happens. So this is nifty, but really not, you don't need to configure much of this to make Rails functional. So another thing that we need to do is take a look at the linked files and linked directories. Now this is something that's important because when you deploy this, you're going to want certain files to always be shared between each release of your application. For example, your database settings, you don't want to override them every single time that you deploy. You don't want to lose that information. So you can set the linked files to symlink this file to a shared copy of it. So what that means is that you don't want to put the config database.yaml in your GitHub repo. You don't want this in Git, so you want to remove it, and you want to just change this to like an example file so that on the production server you will have this file, but it will be in a shared folder, and then when you deploy, it will link a copy of that into your deployed version. So you'll always have one file, and then all of the deploys that you do, each version, it keeps a bunch around. Each of those will link to this file, and they'll all share that thing. So you can edit it one time if you change your password for the database or something, but they'll always reference the same thing, and you'll never lose that when you deploy. And you don't have to keep the password in your Git repo, which is super important. You don't want to do that. The other thing is you have linked directories, which allows you to do the same thing. So your log directory can point to a shared directory, meaning that all of your logs for every deploy are all combined. And that's going to be important because you'll want one big log file instead of a whole bunch of little ones that are random sizes depending on how long the code was running since your last deploy. The other better example is you want to link the directory for file uploads. If you're uploading pictures to the server and we deploy a new version, if you didn't have this folder linked, then the pictures would be in the old version and they'd be like hiding in there. You'd deploy a new version and then there'd be no pictures on your site. All of them would have disappeared because you deployed a new folder and they were in the old one. So you need to link that folder by putting it, the relative path to it in linked directories. So for example, if you're using, I forget which gem it is that uses public/system, that's an example that you would want to to symlink. So these linked directories are super important in linked files. The other one you want to put in here is config secrets.yaml so that you get your Ruby on Rails secrets there. You can also not link these if you would like to use environment variables, but you have to go and set those up. I prefer to use the secrets.yaml on the server to hard code these files or these API keys, whatever you're putting in here. I would rather this file is just an example file in the config directory, and then you create a copy of this in production. So let's go ahead and move those into a directory. So if we go into our Rails app, let's git move config database.yaml to config database.yaml.example. And then let's do the same thing. We'll git config secrets.yaml, and we'll move that to secrets.yaml.example. And this is going to make sure that the rename happens in Git. So you'll see that staged here, and we will save that to a commit, move database.yaml and secrets.yaml to examples. So this basically means too that everybody using your application in development will have to make a copy of this, and you can put this in your git ignore file as well. So you'll have to specify this name, the git ignore file, manually if you're on a Mac. So you would say config/database.yaml will ignore, and the same thing, secrets.yaml, but we'll leave in the example so that if you're using a different database username or password in your machine and it's different than your coworkers, that's okay. You can make copies of this and have it working the same way in development as you do, rather than forcing everybody on your team to share the same database username and password. That's super annoying, so a lot of people use these examples and let you create that file yourself. So this helps a lot, and now we can go into our deploy folder, and we can make some changes here. So take a look at all the instructions here and make sure that you read everything, and then once you get into the deploy production setting, you can go and basically do two things. This server, the production server, we want to run in production. So this is going to be your Rails environment. So if you're used to saying Rails env equals test or whatever, if you've ever seen that, basically this is what the stage is called in Capistrano. And if you set it to production, it will run with production. If you set it to staging, it will run with staging, so on. Make sure that matches what you want, and that will load up the appropriate environment file and all of that. So we're going to use production here because that is our production file. And the other piece is to set your server. So this is, and you can ignore the rest of these unless you want to make it more complicated, but this is going to be your server's IP address, which you can get from DigitalOcean right there. You can paste that in. We're going to use the deploy user, and then this server acts as the web and app role. So basically this means that it will run certain commands on certain servers, and if you want to make this much more complex, it allows you to have maybe you have 3 web servers, then you have 2 database servers. You can set up Capistrano to do all kinds of complicated things. This is all you really need to do, and I believe you can also put DB in there if you want it to automatically run database migrations. But that you can find more about by looking at Capistrano RB's website. It kind of gives you a giant list of explanations for plugins like Passengers plugin. It will tell you what those do. This allows you to run restarts for Passenger from the command line. For example, you can do all kinds of settings with it and all kinds of stuff. So this is really useful. And I basically want to tell you to make sure that you go and do a lot of this reading along with what we've done here. So this should be all we need to do to set up Capistrano. And we can start by running cat production deploy. And let me just first add all of these Capistrano files to our app. So we'll push that up to GitHub so you can see that. And then let's cat production deploy. So this should fail, actually. We didn't add the passenger gem, and I left that in the cap file. So let's open up the cap file, and I'm going to remove this require Capistrano passenger because we don't actually need it. It's just going to fiddle with that. And now you can run cat production deploy, and we're going to probably run into a few errors here. And one of those is, for example, our Ruby 2.2.2-P95 didn't match. So Capistrano tries to be helpful, but there's a lot of things that kind of silently fail, and you'll have to play with things just to see what matches up. So you can make some changes. For example, I changed the Ruby version to remove the patch version, and that made more progress. So it was like, okay, that's great. We'll continue going. And you'll get to a point down here where it's created a bunch of directories, and it's running these commands in yellow. So those are important. Those are what is actually happening. I guess they're not always yellow, but it's trying to run these commands. And sometimes it's okay if they fail. For example, if there's directories that it needs to ensure exist, then it will run the command. If they already exist, it will fail, but that's okay. So don't be freaking out if you see failures in the output, because that could be a good sign, actually. It might mean that things are set up. Now, this first time that you're going to deploy, it's going to fail because it's going to create these directories. Then it's going to look to symlink your database YAML file, which does not exist because we deleted it from the repo. And we haven't actually done anything inside of our server to set up that file. So if you're in your root directory, or if you go back to your server terminal, you SSH in, and let's clear this out. And if you list the folders in your home directory, you'll get deploy test. So this is what Capistrano created for us. This is where our application lives on the server. Capistrano checks out from GitHub our latest code. It basically connects those database and secrets YAML files, and it also manages a few other things. So if you go into deploy test, you'll notice two folders here. One is releases. This is, if you list out the releases, this is going to be filled with numbers, files or folders full of numbers. And those are the timestamps of the last release that you made. So we haven't had a successful release, so there's nothing in there. But as soon as we do, there will be a folder in there with a timestamp, and that is our release. And it's a copy of your code in GitHub on the server at that moment in time, and it keeps them around so that you can roll back and jump between them if you need to, if you broke something. Everything is always there just in case. The shared directory is used for all of those shared things. So your executables, your log files, your file uploads, those go in the public directory here, and configs. So if we go into shared config, we are going to need to make, let's just touch these files, and we'll make empty files. We'll make database.yaml. Oops. Let's remove that one. Touch database.yaml, and then touch secrets.yaml. So we now have two empty files here, and that's pretty good. But we actually need to make sure that we set this up so that we have our correct files in there. So if you look at your secrets YAML example, there's a secret key base that you need to have. And you need to have that basically look like this. So let's go into our server and open up the secrets.yaml. and paste this in, but let's actually put a new secret key in there. And you can run rake secret from your Rails application to generate a random secret key. And this is used to basically encrypt your cookies, so don't ever share this with anyone. Don't do what I'm doing right now. I'm deleting this as soon as I'm over, so you won't be able to hack into my server or my Rails app. And take that giant key that they gave you, copy all of it, and then paste it into that file and save and quit. So that should configure Rails to have a secret key. If you don't do this, it will complain because it needs one. And then the same thing goes for our database.yaml. Okay, and now we need to go into our gem file and our Rails app one more time. And rather than using SQLite, we're going to change this to the PG gem. So we're going to use Postgres for our database. You could do MySQL2 here if you like. We've already set up Postgres in our example, so we're going to change that around. We're going to run bundle to install that gem. And then on the server, we can edit the database.yaml file, and we can say production adapter is PostgreSQL, and then our database is going to be basically the name of our application. So I'm going to say deploy test. You can change whatever name you would like there. And then you're going to have your username. So we have deploy is our username that we created for our Postgres user. And I just set the password to password. So now that we have the database config set up, we actually need to go manually create it so that Capistrano can launch everything, and then it can run the migrations for us. But we'll need to be able to create the database manually, so we have that available. So there's various ways to do this, but we're going to jump into the root user, we're going to jump into the Postgres user, and we're going to run this Postgres command prompt here. So here we can say create database deploy test, and that's what we gave our database our name in our YAML file. And then I'm going to also say with owner equal to deploy. And that should have created our database. And we can check this out by going back to our deploy user, and we can say we want user deploy password is going to be prompted, and then we want to log into the deploy test database. So we type in our password there. We should get this prompt as we do, and that means that we've correctly created our database and tested our database credentials, our username and password, and everything is working appropriately. So with that said, we can go back to our application, and we can make sure that we add those changes into our commits. So I'm going to make 2 commits here. We're going to have one for fix Ruby version and remove passenger, and then we'll have the Postgres commit. So we'll switch database to Postgres and push those up to GitHub. So another interesting point here is that when you deploy with Capistrano, it's going to go into your server. It's going to then check out with your GitHub, your Git repository onto the server. So you're going to need to push your commits up to GitHub. Then when you deploy, it's going to ask GitHub for the latest version, and that is how it's going to know what to deploy. So make sure you push up to GitHub before you talk to the server and tell it to deploy. So now we have our database connection and our secrets YAML set up. We can run cat production deploy, and we should have a successful deploy this time around. So it's going to run a ton of commands and then compile our assets. Okay, so the last piece that didn't work for us when deploying was it basically tells us we couldn't find a JavaScript runtime. Now you might be thinking, well, this is a Rails application. This is actually required because you need something like Node.js installed on your operating system so that when you run assets precompile, it can take the CoffeeScript, convert it to JavaScript, etc. So a JavaScript runtime is important for that, and you can SSH into your server and run sudo apt-get install node.js, and that will go ahead and install it on your machine. And you don't really need to worry about having the latest version of that, so long as that it's compatible and you can run your asset compilation. So one last time, we can run cat production deploy, and everything should be all fully set up when it's finished. Alrighty then, so now we have a successful deploy of Capistrano. So if we go into our server and we take a look at the deploy test releases folder, you should see that there's now 2 folders. So the last one failed because the assets didn't get compiled, but it stayed around. And then the most recent one has succeeded because, and it stayed because it has succeeded. So now if we list out this folder, we have a couple different things. We now have a current directory, and this is actually where the live version of your Rails application runs. And if I run this ls-la, you'll notice that the current directory is actually not a directory at all. It's a symlink. It's the same link to another folder as we were talking about with the file uploads, with database.yaml and secrets.yaml. So current actually just points to the most recent release, and you can remove current and replace it with the symlink to an older version anytime in the future if you would like. Capistrano helps you do that with the rollback command, but you can also do this manually. It's not doing any magic here. So yeah, now we have everything correctly done, and you can run cap-t if you would like to see the Capistrano commands that are available to you. So you've got a whole bunch of things. You can have it check all the directories and linked files and all that. You can have it run your migrations, and that will set up the database for you. So the last piece that we have here is setting up Nginx to point to our Rails directory. Now, the key piece here is just to copy this file and replace the default web server on the Nginx config on the server. So that is easily done by saying sudo vim etc nginx sites enabled, and then default. And this is the file that has the example server that you saw when we visited the IP address. And basically, that is exactly what this is doing for us. So if you take out all of these comments, you'll see that there's not too much stuff going on in here. And we can also get rid of that example. This is really pretty straightforward for a configuration. Basically, you set the port that you would like to listen to. All web servers should listen on port 80. And if you're doing SSL, it should be on port 443. But you also have to configure your SSL certificates. So we won't get into that today, but you can definitely look that up. Tons of people have written about it, and it's not too bad. But we're going to replace this and paste in our configuration. So if you have your DNS configured and you're trying to set up a domain, you can set your server name to the domain you would like. And then the only other thing you're going to need to change in here is that you want it to be home deploy and deploy test. So you'll change this to point to your app's name. And basically this says run your Rails app in production, make sure that it's using passenger, and listening to port 80. And that's really it. So if you now run sudo service nginx restart, this should restart your Nginx app. And then going back to your IP address, in theory, when you refresh this page, it takes a little bit longer because it's loading Rails for the first time. And you might get prompted with an error like we just did right here. But this is good because this means that it's a Rails application error. We are actually the ones that are missing something. Maybe we missed migrations or something like that. This is easily deduced by going into your app, current directory, and then you can run less log production.log. And you can see if you press Shift-G and go to the very bottom, you can see exactly the errors because they're logging just like they normally would in development. So for example, my application had nothing in it, so when it tried to match the get route, there was nothing there and it crashed. So if we were to run a Rails generate scaffold and make a user, and maybe we'll have an email address, and we do this, and basically if we open this up and we go into the routes file and we set that root to users index, we're now able to have something respond on that page. You probably will get a response. Maybe it's an error because you haven't run migrations. Mine was a little bit different, but if we add migrations into our application, so add users, let's push this up. So that's now on GitHub, and we've got code that we need to deploy and we need to run migrations. So now that you've got your application on your server, you can now run cap production deploy :migrate to migrate the database on your server. Now the important piece here is to make sure that the role has the DB role in your production.rb deploy file, because that will this command will get ignored if you don't have that role. So this is one of those roles that requires that. So you'll see it run rakedb migrate and run some commands. And if it doesn't do that and just quits early, then that is probably because you're missing the DB role here. So last but not least, I think it's important to point out that you need to be able to restart the server. So this is deployed, but we can't actually see it working. So if we are to go into our current directory, we can touch a special file called temp restart.txt. And this is in your application directory. This tells Passenger to restart your application and to adopt any changes that you've made. So now we have a successfully running application using Passenger on our brand new server, but we want to make sure this automatically happens when we deploy. So let's make a change to our index file here, and let's just say all users, and we're going to want to make sure that we see that on the server. And the way that we're going to do that is, I think, by using the Capistrano passenger gem. So you want to add this into your gem file, and you'll have that here at the bottom, Capistrano passenger. This used to be in the Capistrano Rails gem, but got moved out. And so you'll run bundle to install that, and then you will go into your cap file, and you can require Capistrano/passenger here, and that should handle restarting your Rails application. So what it will do is basically it says here that it will automatically restart your application when it deploys. So this allows you to do that, and it comes with a bunch of information here as well. So this will give you the flexibility to go ahead and do that. And last but not least, jump into your deploy.rb, and anywhere in here really is good, but you're going to want to paste in set passenger restart with touch is true, because this has kind of changed recently. You're going to need this in order to run that command. And so we've made this change. We've added the Capistrano passenger gem, and we've made this update to the users index. And this means that if we add this and commit it to test automatic restart, if we push this up to GitHub and we say cap production deploy, this should actually update that page on our application as soon as this is finished. So we should be able to refresh the page, and it should do the touch temp restart file for us automatically. So let's check out that in just a second. Okay, cool. That just finished, and as you can see here, if we search for restart.txt, you can see that this ran the touch restart txt command as you would expect, which means you can refresh this page and we should get all users. And that means that we have a fully functional setup with Capistrano, Ubuntu, Passenger, Nginx, Postgres, all of that on our server is working right now. And that means that you can make your commits, push it up to GitHub, run cap production deploy, and it will show up on production. So there's a whole lot of stuff to wrap your head around with this. I think it's important to learn all of it. Basically, I have to learn a lot of Linux things, and this stuff changes constantly. So I can write this tutorial, but it's always out of date really quickly. Passenger decides to change how it restarts itself, whatever. You can use my tutorial as a guide, and hopefully this helps you get through everything, but I really am doing this to help you wrap your head around we're creating a directory for every time we deploy, and then we're linking to that, and we have one central current place, the folder named current, and it's a link to one of those deployments, and there's a database on the server somewhere. Deployment is fairly complicated, which is why it's not near as simple as using PHP, but it's also very vastly more flexible than anything that you're kind of doing before. This is a giant hurdle, and if you get through this, it's really, really useful to know, so keep at it. Try it a few times, delete your server, restart from scratch. Even recording this, I ran into things that I haven't seen before, so you'll always kind of run into that, but learn Linux, get familiar with it. This stuff is the way that your application lives. If you don't know how your application lives and runs and executes, you won't know the underlying tools, and you probably won't be able to make it near as fast or as great as you would otherwise. I hope you enjoyed this. Leave a comment below if you ran into any issues. Please help out in the community. This is not an easy thing to do all the time for everyone, so share any fixes you found or bugs or whatever, and we'll try and keep this tutorial up to date and shared constantly. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in another video. Peace.